100 Hell's Angels stormed a bar after hearing what happened to their friend's sister. It started like any other night, until a kind-hearted waitress was humiliated and thrown out of her job for standing up to the wrong man. She thought no one would stand by her, but she didn't know who was listening because miles away, her brother, a reformed biker turned preacher, made one phone call. And within hours, the roar of 100 engines filled the town. Everyone expected violence. But what those bikers did next left the whole world speechless. They didn't come to fight. They came to show the world what real justice looks like. Now, as the town takes sides and hidden truths surface, one woman's courage will test what forgiveness really means, and one brother's past will define his redemption. When the angels ride for love instead of vengeance, will they change hearts or burn bridges forever? The neon beer signs cast their usual dim glow across Dusty Pete's worn wooden tables. Alicia moved between them with practiced ease. Her serving tray balanced perfectly as she topped off coffee cups and cleared empty plates. Her brown ponytail was coming loose after 8 hours on her feet, but she kept her gentle smile in place. "Need anything else, Mr. Johnson?" she asked the elderly regular in the corner booth. He was nursing his usual cup of decaf and working on a crossword puzzle. "I'm all set, sweetheart. You take care of yourself tonight." He looked up at her with grandfatherly concern. "Getting mighty rough in here lately." Alicia nodded, understanding his meaning. Thursday nights had been bringing in a rougher crowd these past few months. She glanced at the wall clock. 8:45 p.m. Just a few more hours until close. "Hey, Pete," she called softly to her boss behind the bar. "I'm going to do a quick bathroom check." Pete barely looked up from counting liquor bottles. "Whatever, just make it fast." The bathrooms were clean enough. She had scrubbed them herself that morning. As she headed back to the main room, the bell above the door jangled. A group of local wannabe bikers swaggered in, led by Kyle Matthews. Alicia's stomach tightened. Kyle had a reputation for harassing female staff at bars all over the county. "3 pitchers of Bud," Kyle shouted, throwing himself into a booth. His friends crowded in around him, their leather vests decorated with patches from No Real Motorcycle Club. Alicia grabbed the pitchers and headed to their table. "Here you go, guys. Can I get you anything else?" Kyle's bloodshot eyes fixed on her. "How about your number, sweet thing?" His friend snickered. "Sorry, I don't give out my number at work," Alicia said politely, starting to turn away. She'd had plenty of practice letting men down gently. "Aw, come on, don't be like that." Kyle's voice had an edge to it now. "We're just trying to be friendly." For the next hour, Alicia did her best to avoid their table, but Kyle's group kept demanding service. With each pitcher, their comments got cruder. She could feel Kyle watching her every move across the bar. "Miss, we need more wings," Kyle called out for the 3rd time. Alicia approached cautiously. "I'll get those right away." As she turned to leave, Kyle grabbed her wrist. His grip was tight enough to hurt. "Why are you being so stuck up? Think you're too good for us?" "Please let go," Alicia said quietly, very aware of how alone she was. The regular customers were pointedly looking away. Pete was in the back office, counting the day's receipts. "Maybe you just need to loosen up a little." Kyle stood, still gripping her wrist. He was much taller than her, using his size to crowd her against the jukebox. The neon lights from the machine painted his face in harsh colors. "I said let go." Alicia's voice was firmer now, though her heart was racing. She could smell the beer on his breath. Kyle's other hand reached for her waist. "Come on, baby. Just one dance." "No." Alicia tried to pull away, but his grip tightened painfully. His fingers dug into her side as he yanked her closer. Without thinking, Alicia's free hand came up and cracked across his face in a sharp slap that echoed through the suddenly silent bar. Kyle stumbled back, more shocked than hurt. His face turned ugly with rage. "You crazy bitch! What the hell is going on out here?" Pete emerged from his office, scowling at the scene. "Your waitress just attacked me!" Kyle shouted, holding his reddened cheek. "I was just trying to be friendly and she went psycho." He grabbed me, Alicia protested, her voice shaking. He wouldn't let go. Shut up, Pete cut her off. His face was flushed with anger. I saw you hit a paying customer. That's all I need to know. But You're fired. Pete's voice was cold. I won't have some unstable woman causing trouble in my establishment. Get your things and get out before you completely ruin this bar's reputation. Alicia stood frozen, feeling dozens of eyes on her. Kyle's friends were laughing openly now. Even some of the regulars who knew her were looking away in embarrassment. With trembling hands, Alicia untied her apron. She walked to the break room, gathered her purse and jacket, and headed for the door. Cruel laughter followed her out into the dark parking lot. She made it to her old Honda Civic before the tears started falling. Her wrist throbbed where Kyle had grabbed her. The envelope with her tips from that night, money she desperately needed for her mother's heart medication, was still sitting in her apron pocket inside. But she couldn't bring herself to go back in there, not with Kyle and his friends still inside. Not with Pete's angry words still ringing in her ears. Not with the weight of public humiliation pressing down on her chest. Alicia's hands shook as she put the key in the ignition. What was she going to tell her mother? How would she pay the bills now? The question swirled in her mind as she pulled out of the parking lot, leaving behind the garish neon signs of Dusty Pete's and 3 years of her life. In her rearview mirror, she could still see Kyle and his friends through the bar's front window, raising their glasses in mocking celebration. Pete was already interviewing a younger blonde woman who'd been hanging around the bar lately, probably for her job. Alicia drove home in silence. Her tears finally drying on her cheeks. She'd need to be composed before she got home. Her mother couldn't handle any extra stress with her heart condition. For now, she'd have to pretend everything was fine, even as her world crumbled around her. What she didn't know was that Mr. Johnson, the kindly regular with his crossword puzzles, had seen everything, and he remembered a phone number he'd been given years ago by someone who'd once promised to help if trouble ever came to town. The headlights of Alicia's weathered Toyota cast long shadows as she pulled into the gravel driveway of the Pine Haven trailer park. Her hands still trembled on the steering wheel, and she took several deep breaths before cutting the engine. The digital clock on her dashboard blinked 11:47 p.m. At least she'd made it home before midnight. Through the window of their single-wide trailer, she could see the blue flicker of the television. Her mother would still be awake, waiting up for her like always. Alicia dabbed at her eyes with her sleeve one last time, straightened her waitress uniform, and forced a smile onto her face. The screen door creaked as she entered. Margaret sat in her usual spot, nestled in the worn leather recliner they'd found at a yard sale 2 summers ago. Clear plastic tubing ran from her nose to the oxygen tank beside her, and a thin afghan covered her legs despite the warm spring evening. "There's my girl," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her smile, though tired, lit up her pale face. "How was work, sweetheart?" Alicia's throat tightened. She couldn't tell her mother the truth. Not about Kyle's wandering hands, the humiliation in front of everyone, or Pete's cruel words. The doctor had warned them that stress could worsen Margaret's condition. "Oh, you know," Alicia managed, hanging her purse on the hook by the door. "Pretty quiet. Pete's cutting some hours since business is slow." The lie felt bitter on her tongue. Margaret's eyebrows drew together with concern. "Cutting hours? But you need those hours, honey." "Don't worry, Mom." Alicia moved behind the recliner and kissed her mother's thin gray hair. "I'll figure something out. I always do." She gestured at the TV, desperate to change the subject. "What are you watching?" "Some old movie about angels," Margaret replied, but her worried eyes stayed on her daughter. "There's leftover casserole in the fridge if you're hungry." "Thanks, but I think I'll just have some tea." Alicia retreated to the small kitchen, separated from the living room by a half wall. She filled the kettle with shaking hands, the events of the night replaying in her mind like a bad movie. While the water heated, she pulled out her mother's medication organizer and began counting pills against the prescriptions. The little blue blood pressure pills were running low. Another expense she couldn't afford to delay. The power bill sat unopened on the counter, but she already knew it would be higher than last month's. The kettle hadn't even started whistling when her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Eddie, one of the regulars who'd been coming to Dusty Pete's since before she started working there. Unlike the others, Eddie had always treated her with grandfatherly kindness, leaving generous tips and running interference when some of the rowdier customers got out of line. The message made her stomach clench. That wasn't right. What happened tonight? Someone should know. Alicia typed back quickly. Please don't make trouble. Eddie? I'll be fine. But Eddie had already seen too much. In his own kitchen across town, the old man sat with his ancient flip phone open, scrolling through his contacts. He paused at one name he hadn't called in years, remembering a promise he'd made long ago to keep an eye on things. The kettle whistled, making Alicia jump. She poured the hot water over a chamomile tea bag, watching the steam rise in the dim kitchen light. From the living room, she could hear her mother coughing softly. You okay out there, Mom? She called. Just fine, honey, Margaret answered between coughs. Come sit with me when you're done? Of course. Alicia grabbed her tea and settled onto the threadbare couch next to her mother's recliner. The old movie played on, something about divine intervention and second chances. Margaret reached over and patted her daughter's knee. You'd tell me if something was really wrong, wouldn't you? Her mother asked softly. Alicia squeezed her mother's frail hand. Everything's fine, Mom. Promise. But as the night wore on and Margaret finally dozed off in her chair, Alicia sat in the kitchen with her cold tea, trying to make impossible numbers add up. The calculator app on her phone showed the same brutal math no matter how many times she ran it. Without her job at the bar, they'd be out of money before the month's end. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, Ray had just finished leading an evening prayer group at New Hope Community Church. The small white building sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd, its steeple barely visible against the star-filled Montana ski he locked up for the night, his mind already on tomorrow's sermon. The spring air carried the scent of lilacs as he walked to his truck. His phone rang just as he reached for the door handle. The number wasn't saved in his contacts, but he recognized it instantly. Eddie, from his old life, from the town he'd left behind. Ray's hand hesitated over the answer button. In his 10 years since leaving the Hells Angels, he'd worked hard to build a new life. His congregation knew about his past. He'd been honest with them from the start, but he kept those old connections at arm's length. Still, Eddie had been different. Eddie had promised to watch over Alicia when Ray couldn't. He answered on the 4th ring. Eddie? Ray. The old man's voice was grave. We need to talk about your sister. Ray listened in silence as Eddie described the scene at the bar. Kyle's harassment, Alicia's self-defense, Pete's cruel dismissal. With each detail, his expression darkened, his free hand tightening into a fist. She never even told me she worked there, Ray said quietly when Eddie finished. The words carried the weight of 10 years of distance, of choices made and bridges burned in the name of salvation. The church's shadow fell across him as he stood there, caught between his past and present. In the distance, a train whistle echoed through the valley, long and mournful in the spring night. The afternoon sun slanted through the stained glass windows of Ray's small church office, casting pools of colored light across his worn wooden desk. His fingers traced the edge of an old photograph, creased and softened from years of handling. In it, a teenage Ray stood proudly next to his little sister Alicia, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. They were both smiling, genuine and bright, without the weight of the years that would come between them. Ray leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. The quiet of the empty church pressed in around him, broken only by the gentle tick of an old wall clock. His eyes never left the photograph. I was supposed to protect you, he whispered to the image of his younger sister. The words hung heavy in the still air. The memories came flooding back, as vivid as yesterday. He remembered the rumble of motorcycles, the weight of his leather cut adorned with patches that commanded respect and fear. The Hells Angels had been more than just a club. They'd been his identity, his family. As an enforcer, he'd been the one they called when messages needed sending. His reputation had preceded him in those days. Until that night in Reno. Ray's hand unconsciously moved to his chest, feeling the raised scar tissue beneath his shirt. The doctors had called it a miracle that he'd survived the shooting. 3 bullets, point-blank range. As he'd laid there on the cold asphalt, bleeding out under the harsh neon lights, he'd heard a voice. Not the panicked shouts of his brothers, not the wail of approaching sirens, but something deeper, something that had reached into his soul and changed everything. "I promised you I'd walk away if you let me live," Ray said softly, his eyes closing at the memory. "And I did. But I walked away from her too." He reached for his phone, opening his voicemail and scrolling to the one message he'd never deleted. Alicia's voice, broken and desperate, filled the quiet room. "Ray, please, I know you're out there somewhere. Mom's sick, and I can't do this alone. Just come home. Please, big brother, just come home." The timestamp showed it was from 8 years ago. He'd been 3 months into his ministry training then, trying to build a new life, trying to become someone worthy of God's grace. He'd told himself that staying away was protecting her, keeping the darkness of his past from touching her life. But he'd been wrong. He saw that now. Ray stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. He moved to the back closet, his steps echoing in the empty office. Behind boxes of hymn books and donation receipts sat a small wooden box, its surface smooth from age. He'd kept it all these years, though he'd sworn never to open it again. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. The familiar smell of leather and oil rose up, carrying with it 1,000 memories. There lay his original patch, the colors still vibrant despite the yucky years. Beneath it, a burner phone. Old but maintained, its battery religiously charged every month. And finally, a small black notebook with numbers and names he'd promised himself he'd never use again. Ray sank into his chair, the box heavy in his lap. The afternoon light had shifted, the colors from the stained glass now painting the wall behind him in deep reds and golds. He stared at the phone, turning it over in his hands. "Lord," he prayed, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know you brought me out of that life for a reason. I know you gave me this ministry, this chance to serve. But Alicia, she needs more than just prayers right now. She needs her brother, the real one, not the coward who ran away." He flipped open the notebook, his finger running down the list of names until it stopped on one. Doc Reaper, the old road captain, a legend in his own right. Doc had been the one who'd visited Ray in the hospital after the shooting, who'd respected his decision to leave, who'd made sure no one interfered with his new path. Ray looked again at the photograph on his desk, at his sister's smiling face, so full of trust and love. He remembered how she used to look up to him, how she'd believed her big brother could fix anything. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost the right to be that person in her life. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to earn it back. His fingers moved across the keypad, muscle memory bringing up a number he hadn't dialed in a decade. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Ray's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the same question. Was he doing the right thing? Then a familiar gravelly voice answered, rough as worn leather but warm with recognition. "Brother, it's been a long time." Ray took a deep breath, his voice steady as he replied, "Yeah, and I need a favor. For my sister." The fluorescent lights of the Highway 12 truck stop buzzed overhead as 3 weathered men in leather vests sat at the counter. Their patches marked them as Hell's Angels, but their demeanor was calm, almost contemplative as they nursed their coffee. The morning rush had died down, leaving only the quiet clink of spoons and the soft whir of the industrial fan. Doc Reaper, his silver beard neatly trimmed and his reading glasses perched on his nose, held up his phone. The other 2 men, Big Mike and Tommy 2 times, leaned in as he read the text aloud. She's family. I need eyes and boots. 1 week. Ray's sister? Tommy asked, his voice scratchy from years of cigarettes. Didn't even know he had one. Doc set down his phone and took a slow sip of coffee. He protected her, kept her separate from club business. Smart man. He looked at the other two. You both remember what Ray did for us in '98? Big Mike nodded, absently touching the scar on his neck. Pulled me out of that bar fight in Reno. Would have bled out if he hadn't been there. Saved my marriage, Tommy added quietly. Got me clean when nobody else could. Doc pulled out a small notebook, its pages dog-eared and stuffed with numbers. Then we owe him. Time to make those calls. For the next hour, the three men worked their phones. Doc's voice carried authority as he contacted chapter presidents across Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. The message was simple but powerful. Ray's sister was assaulted. She didn't even ask for help. But we ride anyway. Each call sparked another, creating a chain reaction across the Brotherhood. Some were retired, others still active, but they all remembered Ray, the enforcer who became a preacher, the man who'd saved so many of them before finding his own salvation. Meanwhile, across town, Alicia sat in her third waiting room of the day. The vinyl chair squeaked as she shifted, clutching her folder of resumes. The diner manager had barely glanced at her application. The gas station already had 3 people training. Now she waited at Little Treasure's daycare, watching cartoon characters dance across the walls. I'm sorry, the director said after a 10-minute interview. We require certification for all our staff, but we can keep your application on file. Alicia nodded, managing a polite smile as she gathered her things. In her car, a tired Honda with 200,000 miles on it, she pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. The folder slid off her lap, scattering resumes across the passenger seat. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every billboard advertising jobs seemed to mock her. When she finally pulled up to the trailer, she took a moment to compose herself before going inside. Her mother sat in her usual spot, oxygen tubes in place, watching a game show. There's my girl, Margaret said, her voice warm but worried. How was the job hunting? Some good leads, Alicia lied, hanging up her jacket. They said they'll call next week. Margaret muted the TV. Honey, I know something's wrong. You're not sleeping, barely eating. What happened at the bar? Nothing, Mama. Just cutting hours like I told you. Alicia moved to the kitchen, opening cabinets. How about some soup? I can make your favorite, chicken and dumplings. We're out of chicken, Margaret called, and nearly everything else. But don't worry about me. I'm not very hungry anyway. Alicia's throat tightened as she stared at the nearly empty shelves. A few cans of vegetables, some crackers, half a loaf of bread. She opened the fridge. Milk about to expire, 2 eggs, condiments. Later that night, after her mother had gone to bed, Alicia sat at the kitchen table counting coins from an old mason jar. The total came to $27.43. Not even enough for a decent grocery run. Her eyes drifted to her mother's jewelry box on the windowsill, specifically to the gold necklace her father had given Margaret on their 20th anniversary. The next morning, while her mother napped, Alicia drove to Randy's Pawn and Loan. The bell chimed as she entered, and Randy himself looked up from his newspaper. He'd known her family for years. Just need a little help until payday, Alicia explained softly, placing the necklace on the counter. They both knew it was a lie. There wouldn't be a payday anymore, but Randy was kind enough not to mention it. He examined the necklace carefully, then counted out 190. I'll hold it as long as I can, he promised. You come back when things turn around. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Dusty Pete's parking lot as Kyle lounged against the bar, already 3 beers in. Pete wiped glasses, nodding along as Kyle recounted the previous night's events for the 4th time. Had to be done, Pete declared, reaching for another glass. Can't have that kind of drama in here. Bad for business. He gestured proudly at the half-empty bar. Keeping the place clean, That's what matters. A low rumble caught their attention. A motorcycle, somewhere in the distance. Pete didn't think much of it at first. Bikers often passed through on their way to bigger towns. But then another engine joined the first, and another, and another. The sound grew steadily, like approaching thunder. By sunset, the rumble had become a roar that echoed across the county. On the horizon, the first wave of Hell's Angels appeared, their bikes gleaming in the dying light as they crossed the county line. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across Route 47 as the rumble of motorcycles filled the Montana air. Chrome glinted off dozens of bikes, their riders wearing the distinctive patches of Hell's Angels chapters from across 5 states. The formation stretched for nearly half a mile. A living, breathing snake of steel and leather moving with purpose down the highway. At the front, Doc Reaper led the pack, his weathered face set with determination behind his sunglasses. His gray beard whipped in the wind as he guided the column past fields of wheat and scattered farmhouses. Every small town they passed through fell silent, people stopping in their tracks to watch the impressive display of synchronized riding. "Would you look at that?" whispered a teenage clerk at a gas station, pressed against the window with wide eyes. "Must be 30. No, 50 of them at least." His older coworker shook his head. "Haven't seen this many angels in one place since '92. Word is, they're headed to Dusty Pete's. Something's fixing to happen tonight, Ace." The bikers converged on an abandoned rest stop just outside town, gravel crunching under their wheels as they pulled in with military precision. The sun was getting low now, casting everything in amber light as they dismounted and gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices. Meanwhile, in her small trailer, Alicia stood at the stove, stirring a pot of homemade soup. The kitchen was filled with the warm aroma of vegetables and herbs. A simple meal, but one she knew her mother loved. She'd managed to buy fresh ingredients that morning, though every time she thought about her mother's pawned necklace, her stomach twisted with shame. "Smells wonderful, honey," Margaret called from her recliner in the living room, oxygen tubes trailing behind her. "Just like your grandmother used to make," Alicia forced a smile, though her mother couldn't see it. "Thanks, Mom. It'll be ready in a few minutes." She reached into the cabinet for bowls, trying to push away thoughts of unpaid bills and dwindling savings. Back at the rest stop, a familiar pickup truck kicked up dust as it approached. Ray's old Ford pulled in among the motorcycles, and the gathered bikers straightened up as he stepped out. He looked different from his riding days, wearing dark jeans and a plain button-down instead of leather, his pastor's collar visible at his neck. But there was still something of the old enforcer in his steady gaze and confident stride. "Brother Ray," Doc Reaper called out, stepping forward to wrap him in a bear hug. "Still riding that steel horse for Jesus, I see," Ray laughed, embracing his old friend. "Good to see you too, Doc. Been too long." The other angels gathered around, some Ray hadn't seen in a decade. There were playful jabs about his new calling, but underlying it all was genuine respect. They'd all seen Ray at his darkest, and his transformation meant something to each of them. "Tommy, is that you?" Ray called out to a younger rider. "Last time I saw you, you were just a prospect washing bikes." "Full patch now, 6 years running," Tommy replied proudly. "Never forgot what you taught me about respect." The reunion settled into something more serious as the sun dipped lower. Ray gathered them all in a loose circle, his expression growing solemn. The playful atmosphere faded as he began to speak. "I want to thank you all for coming," he said, his voice carrying across the group. "Some of you rode hundreds of miles. All of you left your lives behind for a few days, no questions asked. That means more than I can say." He paused, looking around at the faces of his former brothers. "But I need to be clear about tonight. This isn't about revenge. It's not about intimidation or violence. We're here because sometimes justice needs witnesses. Sometimes the quiet ones need to know they're not alone." Nods rippled through the crowd. Doc Reaper spoke up. "We remember what you did for us, Ray. All of us. Tonight, we stand for your sister. And we do it right. added another angel, drawing murmurs of agreement. Ray continued. That bar owner, Pete, he thinks he can humiliate people because they're powerless. He thinks nobody important is watching. Tonight, we show him different. We show him that every person has family somewhere. That dignity matters. That actions have consequences. The gathering had taken on an almost sacred quality in the fading light. These were men who had lived hard lives, who had seen the worst of humanity. But they were also men who understood brotherhood, loyalty, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Mount up, Doc Reaper called out as Ray finished speaking. The single command sent everyone into motion, a choreographed dance of leather and metal as riders straddled their bikes. Engines roared to life one by one, until the rest stop thrummed with barely contained power. Headlights clicked on, cutting through the gathering dusk. Ray got back in his truck, ready to follow behind. The formation pulled out onto the main road, now swelled to nearly 100 bikes. They rode through town like a rolling thunder, their presence impossible to ignore. People emerged from shops and restaurants, standing in doorways and on sidewalks to watch the procession. Martha, come look at this, called a diner owner to his wife. I ain't never seen anything like it. The local sheriff stood outside his office, arms crossed, but made no move to interfere. He recognized this wasn't a typical gang ride. There was too much order, too much purpose. As night settled over the small Montana town, the parade of headlights moved steadily toward Dusty Pete's. The roar of engines echoed off buildings, then gradually died down as the massive group began to pull into the bar's parking lot. One by one, the bikes went silent, until only the tick of cooling engines could be heard in the darkness. Inside Dusty Pete's, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Through the windows, patrons could see the parking lot filling with Hell's Angels, their patches and cuts clear under the lot's fluorescent lights. The scene was both impressive and surreal, like something from a movie playing out in real time on a quiet Thursday night in rural Montana. The neon beer signs cast their usual red-blue glow across Dusty Pete's worn bar top. Kyle lounged against the counter, his fourth beer nearly empty as he gestured wildly, entertaining a small crowd with his version of last week's events. So I barely touched her shoulder, right? And this crazy waitress just loses it. Kyle's voice carried across the half-full bar. Starts screaming, slaps me for no reason. Pete wiped glasses behind the bar, forcing a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. Had to let her go. Can't have that kind of liability around here. Tough decision, but that's business. The jukebox thumped out an old country song, nearly drowning out the scattered chuckles from the regular crowd. The usual Thursday night scene at Dusty Pete's played out like any other, until the front doors swung open. The music seemed to fade into nothing as black leather jackets filled the doorway. One by one, Hell's Angels entered the bar, their patches gleaming in the dim light. They moved with quiet purpose, no shoving or shouting, just the soft creak of leather and the steady thud of heavy boots on wooden floors. Pete's hand froze mid-wipe on a glass, his knuckles white. His eyes darted to the baseball bat mounted behind the bar. Useless against this many. But the bikers weren't reaching for weapons. They simply spread out, filling every available space in the bar with calm precision. Weathered men with gray beards took the corner booths. Younger ones lined the walls. Some sat at empty tables. Others stood quietly near the pool tables. The regular customers pressed themselves against the walls, leaving clear paths between them and the angels. The silence grew heavier with each passing second. Kyle's smirk had vanished, replaced by a sickly pallor as he gripped his beer bottle like a shield. Pete's mouth went dry as he recognized some of the faces, men whose reputations preceded them across state lines. When Ray entered last, Pete's stomach dropped. The former enforcer looked different now. No leather, just simple clothes and an old Bible in his hand. But his presence commanded attention just as it had in his wilder days. Ray's eyes swept the room before settling on Pete. Evening, everyone. Ray's voice was quiet, but carried to every corner. Some of you know me. Some don't. But you all know my sister, Alicia. Pete's hands started trembling. Kyle tried to slide off his bar stool, but a large biker silently shifted to block his path. Ray moved to the center of the room, his boots scraping against sawdust. My sister worked here for 3 years. Double shifts, night shifts, holiday shifts. Never complained. Even when her mother got sick, she showed up early, stayed late. He paused, letting the words sink in. The silence in the bar was absolute now, broken only by the gentle hum of the neon signs. Last week, a man put his hands on her without permission. Ray's gaze fell on Kyle, who seemed to shrink into himself. When she defended herself, she was publicly humiliated, fired without cause, called crazy, made to feel worthless. Pete opened his mouth to object, but the words died in his throat as Doc Reaper, legendary among writing circles, stood up from his corner booth. The old biker's scarred face and steel-gray eyes carried decades of hard-earned wisdom. Here's what actually happened. Doc's gravelly voice rumbled through the bar. We talked to witnesses, got security footage from the widow across the street. Your customer there, he nodded toward Kyle, grabbed her 3 times after she said no, cornered her by the jukebox. And when she finally defended herself, 1 slap after repeated harassment, you sided with him. Ray placed his Bible on the bar counter. We're not here for revenge. That's not God's way, and it's not our way anymore. We're here because sometimes people forget what respect looks like. Sometimes they need a reminder about dignity, about truth. Doc Reaper approached the bar, reaching into his jacket. Pete flinched, but the biker only pulled out a thick envelope. He placed it carefully on the counter, his weathered hand smoothing the paper. 3 times her lost wages, Doc announced. She earned this. You didn't. But maybe it'll help you remember that actions have consequences. Kyle, perhaps emboldened by alcohol or desperate to save face, suddenly burst out, You can't just come in here and… A older biker with gentle eyes and a massive frame stepped forward. His voice was surprisingly soft. Sit down, boy. We're not here to hurt you, but listen and learn. Kyle's mouth snapped shut. He sank back onto his stool, eyes fixed on his beer bottle. Ray moved to the center of the room again. I'd like to say a prayer, if you'll permit it. Not just for Alicia, but for everyone here. The angels bowed their heads. Slowly, cautiously, others in the bar did the same. Lord, Ray's voice was clear and steady. We ask for healing tonight. For those who've been hurt, give them strength. For those who've done wrong, give them wisdom. Help us remember that every person, man or woman, rich or poor, deserves to be treated with dignity. Help us find forgiveness, even when it's hard. Amen. Amen. Rumbled through the bar, spoken by leather-clad bikers and regular customers alike. One by one, the angels began filing out. Their boots made soft thuds against the floor, their leather jackets creaking quietly. No threats were made, no glasses broken, no voices raised. Just the steady sound of departure. The roar of motorcycles outside grew and then faded as the angels pulled away into the night. The sound of those engines echoed through the streets of the small town, carrying with them a message that would never be forgotten. In the bar, the envelope sat untouched on the counter. Pete stared at it, his hands still shaking slightly. Kyle remained frozen on his stool. The regular customers looked at each other, then at the door, then back at each other, witnesses to something extraordinary. The neon signs still hummed. The jukebox had gone silent. And in that quiet moment, every person in Dusty Pete's knew that something fundamental had shifted in their small corner of Montana. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as the town stirred to life. At Joe's Diner, the usual breakfast crowd huddled over steaming coffee cups, their conversations unusually animated. Phones passed from hand to hand, showing shaky videos of last night's events at Dusty Pete's. Did you see how quiet they were? Just walked in and sat down, whispered Martha, the head waitress, to her regular customers. My cousin was there, added Tom from behind the counter. Said it was the most powerful thing he'd ever seen. Not a single threat made. The bell above the diner's door chimed as Claire Thompson walked in, notepad tucked under her arm. At 35, she had the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent years chasing stories for the local paper. But this morning, something felt different. The energy in the air was electric. She ordered coffee and listened, jotting down snippets of conversation. The story wasn't what she'd expected. Instead of tales of intimidation, she heard words like dignity and respect repeated over and over. After breakfast, Claire drove her old Honda down the dusty road toward Pau, the small church where Ray now preached. The building was modest, white clapboard with a simple cross above the door. She found Ray in the garden, tending to a small patch of vegetables. "Pastor Ray?" she called out. "I'm Claire Thompson from the Daily Herald." Ray straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. His face was weathered but kind, with eyes that held both strength and gentleness. "Come to write about the scary bikers?" he asked with a slight smile. "Actually," Claire replied, "I'm more interested in why they came. Why peace instead of violence?" Ray gestured to a wooden bench beneath an old oak tree. As they sat, he spoke softly about family, about redemption, about the power of choosing light over darkness. His words weren't rehearsed. They flowed from a place of deep truth. "Violence only begets silence," he said, looking into the distance. "But love? It makes noise that lasts." Claire's pen moved quickly across her notepad, but she found herself stopping often just to listen. This wasn't the story she'd expected to write. This was something more. Across town, Alicia was helping her mother into a comfortable chair when there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Claire Thompson standing there, press badge in hand. "Ms. Thompson?" Alicia's voice was uncertain. "Please, call me Claire. I'd like to hear your side of the story, if you're willing to share it." Alicia glanced at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. They sat in the small living room, where sunlight filtered through thin curtains. Claire noticed the careful way everything was arranged, neat and clean despite their obvious poverty. As they talked, Alicia's phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from people who'd seen the videos. Former customers from the bar, neighbors, even strangers, all offering support, jobs, help. "I don't understand," Alicia said, her voice trembling. "Why now? Why do they care now?" Before Claire could answer, there was another knock. Ray stood in the doorway, his presence filling the small room. Claire quietly excused herself, knowing this was a moment between siblings. "You called them." Alicia's voice rose with emotion. "You brought that life back?" Ray stayed calm, his voice steady. "I didn't bring back the past, Alicia. I brought justice, the kind that heals instead of hurts. But the angels, after everything—" Ray reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "They left this for you. Triple your lost wages. They said you earned it." Alicia's hands shook as she opened the envelope. The amount written on the check made her sink into a chair, tears finally breaking free. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "You deserve so much more," Ray said softly. "I failed you before. But I'm here now, and so is an entire community that sees your worth." Throughout the afternoon, people began stopping by. Mrs. Johnson from the grocery store brought bags of food. Tom from the diner offered her a waitressing position. Better hours, better pay. An envelope appeared with cash collected from the morning church service. Alicia's mother watched it all with tears in her eyes, finally understanding what her daughter had been hiding, finally seeing the community embrace them. As the sun began to set, Alicia sat on her small porch, trying to process everything that had happened. The rumble of a motorcycle made her look up. Doc Reaper's imposing figure approached, but his face was gentle as he held out a small box. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it," he said simply. Inside lay her mother's necklace, the very one she'd pawned for grocery money just days ago. Alicia's hand flew to her mouth. Couldn't let you lose something precious, Doc said with a smile. Alicia's voice was barely above a whisper. Thank you. He nodded, his eyes kind beneath his gruff exterior. No need, ma'am. We're family now. The words settled over her like a warm blanket, healing something deep inside that had been broken for far too long. In the distance, the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. A fitting end to a day that had changed everything. The next morning's newspaper would carry Claire's article. The day angels rode for justice. But the real story wasn't in the headlines. It was in the quiet moments, in the restored dignity, in the knowledge that sometimes family comes in the most unexpected forms. The morning sun filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across Claire Thompson's notebook as she sat in the back pew of Ray's small church. She'd been attending services regularly since writing the article that changed everything. Today's crowd was different, though. A mix of leather vests and Sunday dresses, weathered faces, and gentle smiles. The story just keeps spreading, Claire whispered to the elderly woman beside her, showing her phone screen. Over 50,000 shares now. The article had struck a chord far beyond their little Montana town. It wasn't the conflict that drew people in. It was the resolution, the unexpected grace of it all. Claire had crafted it carefully, focusing not on the initial injustice, but on the quiet strength that followed. Alicia stood near the entrance, greeting people as they arrived. She'd changed in subtle ways over the past few days. Her shoulders were straighter, her smile more genuine. Though still quiet by nature, she'd found a new confidence in helping others. Welcome to First Grace, she said softly to a young woman who entered hesitantly. We have coffee in the fellowship hall if you'd like some. The woman's eyes were red-rimmed, her makeup slightly smudged. Alicia recognized that look. She'd worn it herself not long ago. Without saying a word, she simply reached out and squeezed the woman's hand. Sometimes understanding was enough. In his office, Ray adjusted his collar and said a quick prayer. The sermon notes on his desk were simple. Second chances, written at the top. He didn't need much more. The evidence was all around him. The women's support group had started small. Just 4 people meeting in the church basement. But word spread quickly. Women who'd faced workplace harassment, domestic struggles, or just needed a safe place to talk found their way there. Alicia might not say much during meetings, but her presence spoke volumes. Outside, more motorcycles rumbled into the parking lot. Doc Reaper, cleaned up in a pressed shirt but still wearing his vest, helped an elderly couple navigate the steps. The sight would have been unthinkable a week ago. Brother Ray, Doc called out as the pastor emerged. Brought some friends from the Billings chapter. They heard about what happened. Ray nodded, greeting each rider with a firm handshake. Everyone's welcome here. The morning light caught the chrome of nearly 30 bikes parked in neat rows. Some locals still did double takes at the site, but the fear was gone. These machines that once symbolized threat now represented something else entirely. Redemption. Inside, Claire watched as Alicia organized the morning's bulletins. She'd interviewed her again yesterday for a follow-up piece. The waitress had just accepted a position at Sarah's Sunrise Diner, a beloved local establishment owned by Sarah Chen, a woman who'd read the original article 3 times. I need someone with your kind of strength on my team, Sarah had told her. Someone who stands up for what's right, but leads with kindness. The salary was better, the hours more reasonable. More importantly, it was a place where Alicia could work with dignity. A slight commotion at the door drew Claire's attention. Pete stood there, looking uncomfortable in an ill-fitting suit. Ray had visited him 2 days ago after hearing the bar was struggling. Their conversation had lasted hours. I was wrong, Pete had admitted finally, his voice rough. I've been wrong about a lot of things. Now he shifted from foot to foot, clearly unsure of his welcome. Ray appeared beside him, one hand on his shoulder. Come on in, brother, Ray said quietly. There's room for everyone here. The service began with familiar hymns. Alicia's voice joined the others, stronger than she'd expected. Her mother sat in the front row, oxygen tank beside her, beaming with pride. The necklace Doc had retrieved from the pawn shop glinted at her throat. When Ray took the pulpit, his message was simple but powerful. He spoke of transformation, not just of individuals, but of communities. He talked about how fear could divide people, but love could bridge any gap. "Look around," he said, gesturing to the diverse congregation. "This is what healing looks like. This is what happens when we choose grace over judgment, understanding over anger." Claire's pen moved rapidly across her notebook, but she wasn't just taking notes for an article anymore. She was documenting a moment of genuine change. In the middle of the service, a group of women from Alicia's support group performed Amazing Grace. Their voices filled the small church, some wavering, some strong, all sincere. Through the windows, sunlight danced across the rows of motorcycles outside. Machines that had once inspired fear, now standing as silent witnesses to transformation. Alicia watched it all from her seat beside Ray's pulpit. Tears in her eyes, but peace in her heart. The town that had once seemed so small and confining now felt different. The same streets, the same buildings, but the spirit had changed. The morning light streamed through those stained glass windows, painting everyone in the same warm glow. Bikers and businessmen, waitresses and writers, pastors and prodigals. In that light, the divisions that once seemed so important melted away, leaving only what mattered: community, compassion, and the quiet strength of grace. Claire closed her notebook. Some stories didn't need elaborate words. Sometimes the simple truth was enough. A town divided by fear had found its way to healing, one unexpected ride at a time. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Sally's home cookin' diner, casting warm squares of light across the checkered floor tiles. Alicia moved between tables with practiced ease, her new navy blue apron still crisp and clean. The regular breakfast crowd kept her busy, but it was a different kind of busy than at Dusty Pete's. Here, customers smiled and called her by name. "More coffee, Mrs. Henderson?" Alicia asked, holding up the fresh pot. The elderly woman beamed up at her. "Yes, dear, and I must say, you're a natural here. Sally was smart to snap you up." Alicia felt her cheeks warm as she poured. The past week had been surreal. Strangers stopping her in the grocery store to offer support, church members bringing casseroles to her mother, and even a few former Dusty Pete's regulars making the drive across town just to leave her generous tips. "Speaking of," Sally called from behind the counter, waving an envelope. "This came for you, hun." Alicia tucked the coffee pot under her arm and walked over. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, official-looking. When she saw the return address, Law Offices of Greeley and Moore, her stomach dropped. Her hands trembled as she tore it open right there at the counter. The legal language swam before her eyes, but certain phrases jumped out like accusations. Willful misrepresentation. Damages to business reputation. Cease and desist. And finally, the number. $50,000 in claimed damages. "Alicia?" Sally touched her arm. "You're white as a sheet." "What is it?" She couldn't speak. The room felt too bright, too warm. Pete was suing her. Pete, who'd humiliated her, who'd thrown her out without a second thought, was now trying to take what little she had left. I need to sit down," Alicia managed. Sally guided her to an empty booth. "Take 5, honey. I've got your tables." Alicia read the letter again, slower this time. Pete claimed she'd orchestrated a malicious campaign against his bar, that she'd exaggerated the incident with Kyle, that bringing known criminal elements, the Hells Angels, to intimidate him was part of a scheme to destroy his business. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother's nurse. "Monthly payment due tomorrow. Reminder, rate increase starts this month." Tears welled up, but Alicia blinked them back. She couldn't break down here, not in front of everyone. She'd survived worse. She'd figure this out. The morning rush died down around 10. Alicia kept working, mechanically taking orders and delivering plates, her mind racing. She couldn't afford a lawyer. The money from the bikers had gone straight to her mother's care and back rent. If Pete won, by evening, her shift ended and she drove straight to Ray's church. She found him in his office, reading glasses perched on his nose as he prepared Sunday's sermon. "Ray?" Her voice cracked. One look at her face and he was on his feet. "What happened?" She handed him the letter. Watched as he read it, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he set it down carefully, deliberately, like it might bite. "Pete's scared," Ray said finally. "This isn't about money. It's about control." "I can't fight this," Alicia whispered. "I barely make ends meet as it is. And if word gets out, I'm being sued." She thought of her new job, of Sally's kindness. Who'll want to hire someone with legal trouble? Ray took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Remember what I said about answering hate with love? Well, sometimes love looks like standing your ground. Not with fists, but with truth." He picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. After 2 rings, a familiar gravelly voice answered. "Doc," Ray said. "We need that favor again. Different kind this time." Alicia could hear Doc Reaper's deep rumble through the speaker. Ray explained the situation, his voice steady and clear. "The club's got a legal defense fund," Doc said after a long moment. "Set it up years ago when Jimmy got framed for that bar fight in Reno. We've got connections, veteran lawyers who understand our world. Give me 24 hours. Ray thanked him and hung up. "The brothers take care of their own," he told Alicia. "And like it or not, you're family now." "I never wanted any of this," Alicia said softly. "I just wanted to work, take care of Mom, live quietly." "I know." Ray's eyes were gentle. "But sometimes God puts us in positions we didn't choose. Sometimes our trials aren't just about us. They're about showing others the way through darkness." A knock at the office door made them both look up. Claire Thompson, the newspaper reporter, stood there with a determined expression. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but word travels fast in small towns. I heard about the lawsuit." She stepped inside, clutching her notepad. "People need to know the truth, not just about that night, but about everything that led to it. Would you be willing to tell your full story?" Alicia hesitated. More publicity meant more attention, more judgment. But maybe that's what was needed. "Can I think about it?" she asked. Claire nodded. "Of course, but remember, silence protects the wrong people." As the reporter left, more visitors arrived. Sally from the diner, Mrs. Henderson, Eddie from Dusty Pete's. Word had indeed traveled fast, and they came bearing support, offers of help, and their own stories of times they'd witnessed injustice at the bar, but stayed quiet. Ray watched it all with a small smile. When the last visitor left, he stood and put his arm around Alicia as they stepped out of the church into the cool evening air. "This isn't the end," he told her. "This is the moment we show them what real justice looks like." Alicia looked out at the parking lot, where several cars still lingered. People who'd come just to show support. The weight of the lawsuit still pressed on her chest, but something else was there too. The warmth of knowing she wasn't facing it alone. The morning sun filtered through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Outside, an unusual sight greeted early arrivals. Instead of rumbling motorcycles, a line of well-dressed men in crisp black suits stood quietly on the steps. Their clean-shaven faces and neatly combed hair couldn't completely hide the familiar patches on their leather vests, worn proudly over pressed white shirts. Alicia sat in the courthouse hallway, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Ray placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Remember," he said softly, "truth doesn't need fancy words." Inside the courtroom, Pete's lawyer, Maxwell Greeley, cut an imposing figure in his expensive suit. He arranged papers on the prosecution table with sharp, precise movements. Pete sat beside him, trying to project confidence but failing to hide the sweat beading on his forehead. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Sarah Martinez presiding." As everyone settled back into their seats, Greeley launched into his opening statement. His voice dripped with calculated concern. Your Honor, this case is about a business owner whose reputation has been severely damaged by false allegations and coordinated intimidation. Mr. Peterson has operated Dusty Pete's for 15 years without incident until Ms. Conway's reckless actions and subsequent publicity campaign brought harm to his establishment. Alicia felt her chest tighten as Greeley continued. The defendant's brother orchestrated a show of force using known criminal elements to terrorize legitimate customers. The resulting social media storm has caused Mr. Peterson significant financial losses. Pete took the stand first. Under his lawyer's questioning, he painted a picture of Alicia as unstable and attention-seeking. She was always dramatic, he claimed, straightening his tie. That night, she overreacted to a regular, customers-friendly conversation. When I tried to calm the situation, she stormed out. Next thing I know, my bar is surrounded by bikers. But the tide began to turn during cross-examination. Alicia's lawyer, a calm woman named Patricia Chen, approached the stand. Mr. Peterson, how many harassment complaints have been filed by female employees at your establishment in the past 5 years? Pete shifted uncomfortably. I don't recall exactly. Let me refresh your memory. Chen produced a stack of documents. 7 formal complaints, all mysteriously withdrawn after private meetings with you. Would you care to explain? Before Pete could answer, Sarah Miller, a former waitress, took the stand. Her voice shook slightly, but her words were clear. Pete had a system. Whenever girls complained about customers getting handsy, he'd call them into his office. He'd remind them how lucky they were to have jobs, how easily replaced they could be. Most of us couldn't afford to lose our jobs, so we stayed quiet. Eddie Thompson, the elderly regular who had witnessed everything, testified next. The old man's weathered face was solemn as he recounted that night. I saw that boy grab her, saw her try to get away polite-like first. She only slapped him when he wouldn't let go of her arm. Then Pete, he didn't even ask what happened. Just started yelling at her in front of everyone, calling her crazy. Made my blood boil, it did. A murmur ran through the courtroom as Martha Wilson, a widow who lived above the bar, approached the stand next. She clutched a USB drive in her trembling hands. I've got security cameras on my back porch, she explained. Been there since my Herald passed. They catch the bar's parking lot pretty clear. The footage played on the courtroom screen. Though slightly grainy, it clearly showed Kyle cornering Alicia by the jukebox, her attempts to move away, and the moment he grabbed her arm. The slap was barely visible, but Pete's subsequent tirade was captured in full detail. Judge Martinez watched the video intently, her expression grave. Doc Reaper's testimony drew every eye in the room. Despite his intimidating nickname, he spoke with quiet dignity. Ray called us because he knew we'd understand about protecting family. But he was crystal clear. No violence, no threats. Just show up and remind folks what respect looks like. We didn't break a single glass. Didn't raise a single voice. Just told the truth. When Ray took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He spoke about his past without flinching, about the violence he'd left behind, and about his journey to faith. I used to think strength meant making people fear you, he said, his voice steady. Now I know it's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. His eyes met Alicia's as he continued. My sister never asked for any of this. She just wanted to work hard and take care of our mother. When I heard what happened, I knew I had to help. Not with fists or threats, but by showing her she wasn't alone. That's what family does. Judge Martinez removed her glasses, studying Pete intently. Mr. Peterson, I've heard enough. Not only am I dismissing your defamation claim, but I'm warning you about filing retaliatory lawsuits. The evidence clearly shows Ms. Conway was the wronged party here. She turned to face Alicia. Ms. Conway, your dignity in the face of injustice and your brother's choice to respond with peaceful solidarity rather than violence are commendable. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Alicia threw her arms around Ray. tears streaming down her face. They made their way through the courthouse doors together, where news crews waited with cameras and microphones. Under the bright morning sun, surrounded by supporting faces both rough and gentle, Alicia found her voice. "I never wanted attention," she said softly, wiping away tears. "I just wanted to be treated like a person. Today, I finally feel seen." The morning dew still clung to the grass as Alicia walked toward the diner, her work boots leaving gentle impressions in the dampness. The sun was just beginning to paint the Montana sky in soft pinks and golds. She paused at the corner where Dusty Pete's once stood, its windows now dark and empty. A for sale sign swaying gently in the breeze. 2 weeks had changed everything. The investigation that followed the lawsuit had uncovered years of labor violations, unpaid overtime, and questionable business practices. Pete hadn't just lost face, he'd lost everything. Inside Mary's home cooking, where Alicia now worked, the coffee was already brewing. Mary, the owner, looked up from behind the counter with a warm smile. "You're early again, honey. Thought I'd get a head start on the breakfast rush," Alicia replied, tying her apron. The diner had become more than just a workplace. It was a sanctuary where dignity and respect weren't just words, but a way of life. The bell above the door chimed, and Doc Reaper walked in, trading his usual leather for well-worn jeans and a flannel shirt. Behind him came young Tanner, the local dropout who'd been helping with the shelter construction. "Morning, Miss Alicia," Tanner mumbled, sliding onto a stool. His hands were already rough from construction work, but his eyes held a new spark of purpose. "Ready for that practice test today?" Alicia asked, pouring them both coffee. She'd been helping Tanner study for his GED 3 nights a week, watching him slowly build confidence between hammer swings and textbook pages. "Yes, ma'am," he nodded. "Doc's been drilling me on algebra during lunch breaks." Doc Reaper chuckled, his weathered face creasing. "Kid's got a good head for numbers, better than most of us old road dogs." The morning routine had become a comfortable dance. Regulars filtered in, mixing easily with the bikers who'd stayed behind to help with the shelter. The old barriers of leather and chrome had melted away, replaced by something more genuine, understanding. After her shift, Alicia walked the 3 blocks to the church where Ray was coordinating the day's construction efforts. The shelter's framework rose proudly behind the modest building, its wooden bones reaching toward the sky like prayer hands. Ray stood with a group of volunteers, pointing out where the counseling rooms would go. He'd changed too these past weeks. The weight of his past no longer seemed to burden his shoulders. He caught sight of Alicia and waved her over. "Just in time," he said. "The painting crew needs direction on the sign." Alicia watched as 2 angels, their tattooed arms speckled with paint, carefully traced letters on the wooden board that would become the shelter's welcome sign. Their movements were precise, gentle, so different from the stereotypes she'd once believed. Claire Thompson pulled up in her car, notebook in hand as always. The journalist had become a regular fixture, documenting not just the shelter's progress, but the larger story of community transformation. Her initial article had sparked something unexpected, hope that spread far beyond their small town. "The GoFundMe just passed 60,000, Claire announced, showing Alicia her phone. "People from all over the country are sharing their own stories of redemption and second chances." Tanner appeared with a ladder, his textbook stuffed in his back pocket. "Where do you want this, Miss Alicia?" She pointed to the front of the shelter. "Let's get that sign up before lunch. Then we can review Chapter 5. The work continued through the morning. Hammers singing, saws buzzing, voices calling out measurements and encouragement. Every few minutes, someone would stop by with donations. Blankets, toiletries, home-cooked meals for the workers. At noon, Ray rang the church bell, calling everyone to the community lunch tables set up in the shade. The scene would have been unimaginable just weeks ago. Bikers breaking bread with local teachers, veterans sharing stories with teenage volunteers. All barriers dissolved in the simple act of building something together. Alicia sat between Tanner and Doc Reaper. watching Ray lead a simple blessing over the meal. Her brother caught her eye and smiled. A smile that spoke of healing, of bridges rebuilt, of faith in something larger than their past wounds. After lunch, she walked the perimeter of the shelter, touching the fresh lumber, breathing in the scent of sawdust and possibility. Each nail, each board represented someone's commitment to change. The angels had brought more than muscle. They'd brought hope, showing that even the most feared could become the most trusted. Near the back entrance, she found Doc Reaper teaching Tanner how to install a security light. The older biker's patience with the teenager was touching, his rough hands guiding Tanner's movements with fatherly care. "See, kid," Doc was saying, "sometimes the most important thing ain't the light itself. It's knowing someone cared enough to make sure you can find your way in the dark." Alicia's throat tightened at the words. That's what this was all about, lighting the way for others, just as Ray and the angels had done for her. The afternoon sun was beginning to soften when Claire gathered everyone for a photo in front of the shelter. Alicia stood between Ray and Doc Reaper, with Tanner and the other volunteers crowding in close. Just before the camera clicked, she looked up at the newly mounted sign. The Safe Light Haven, a place where every voice matters. The white paint gleamed fresh and clean against the dark wood. Alicia felt tears welling up, but these weren't tears of shame or fear like those she'd shed at Dusty Pete's. These were different. They carried the weight of gratitude, of wonder at how light could emerge from darkness. She wiped her eyes quietly and whispered, "We built this, together." The late summer sun painted long shadows across the shelter's freshly painted walls as Alicia stood at the podium, her hands only slightly trembling as she faced the crowd gathered for the orientation. The Safe Light Haven sign above the entrance caught the golden light, making the letters shimmer like a beacon of hope. "Welcome, everyone," Alicia began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "A few months ago, I couldn't have imagined standing here. But sometimes life's hardest moments lead us to exactly where we need to be." The meeting room was filled to capacity. Social workers, volunteers, and community members occupied every chair. In the front row, Margaret, Alicia's mother, sat with an oxygen tube discreetly tucked behind her ear. But her eyes were bright and alert. The changes in their lives had done wonders for her health. The reduced stress and increased support had given her a new lease on life. Alicia walked the group through the shelter's services: emergency housing, job placement assistance, counseling, and most importantly, a safe space where dignity came first. As she spoke, she couldn't help but notice how natural it felt now, sharing her vision with others. Ray stood at the back of the room, leaning against the wall with quiet pride. When Alicia finished her presentation, he stepped forward to make his own announcement. "The church is launching something new," Ray said, moving to stand beside his sister. "We're calling it the Road to Redemption program." He paused, scanning the room. "Thanks to partnerships with motorcycle clubs across 5 states, we'll be creating a network of shelters and mentorship programs. Because everyone deserves a second chance. And sometimes, those who've walked the hardest roads make the best guides." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. As people began to mingle and explore the facility, Doc Reaper approached Alicia. His leather vest was well worn but clean, and his gray beard was neatly trimmed. Despite his imposing presence, his eyes were kind. "Got something to ask you," he said, his gravelly voice gentle. "We're having our national gathering in Sturgis next month, South Dakota," he added, noting her questioning look. "Would mean a lot if you'd come speak. Share your story with our brothers and sisters." Alicia's eyes widened. "Me? But I've never spoken to crowds that big." "Sometimes the quietest voices carry the most weight," Doc said, smiling. "Think about it." Ray placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got more strength than you know, sis, and we'll be right there with you." After a moment's hesitation, Alicia nodded. "Okay, yes, I'll do it." The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Alicia worked on her speech between shelter duties and diner shifts, often staying up late to get the words just right. Her mother helped her practice, offering gentle suggestions and unwavering support. When the day finally arrived, Alicia found herself standing before thousands of bikers at the Sturgis gathering. The sea of leather and denim stretched as far as she could see. Doc Reaper had introduced her simply as family, and that one word had given her the courage to step up to the microphone. "My story isn't about violence," she began, her voice clear and steady. "It's about what happens when strength chooses kindness instead." As she spoke about that night at Dusty Pete's, the humiliation, the fear, the feeling of being utterly alone, the crowd grew still. But when she described how the angels had shown up, not with fists, but with dignity and peaceful presence, the attention became electric. "They could have chosen revenge," she continued, emotion thick in her voice. "Instead, they chose to show what real protection looks like. They reminded everyone that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand quietly for what's right." Throughout the crowd, hardened bikers, many of whom had their own stories of redemption, nodded in understanding. Some wiped away tears. Others stood straighter, pride evident in their bearing. "Today, our shelter helps dozens of people find their way back to hope," Alicia said. "And it started because a group of people society often fears chose to be the angels they were named for." The response was overwhelming, not with loud cheers, but with a deep, respectful rumble of support that seemed to shake the ground itself. As she stepped down from the stage, bikers approached one by one to share their own stories of transformation and second chances. Within days, video clips of her speech began circulating online. "When 100 Hell's Angels Chose Kindness" became a viral sensation, touching hearts far beyond the biker community. Messages poured in from around the country, people sharing their own stories of redemption, offering support, asking how they could help start similar programs in their communities. Back in Montana, the impact of those few months was visible everywhere. The town had shed its old prejudices like worn-out clothes, replacing them with something that fit better: understanding, acceptance, and a wider definition of family. On a crisp morning, Alicia stood with Ray and Doc Reaper at the town limits, watching as bikes lined up for the shelter's first charity run. Families had gathered to show support, children sitting on their parents' shoulders to see better. The shelter's new van, donated by a local business, was parked proudly at the front, its side painted with the words, "Every road leads home." The morning sun caught the chrome of the motorcycles, creating a dazzling display. The gentle rumble of idling engines filled the air with anticipation. Ray squeezed Alicia's shoulder gently. "You thought you were alone," he said softly. "But look what happens when you let people ride with you." Alicia gazed out at the scene before her. The bikes, the shelter, the gathered families, all these lives intertwined with hers in ways she never could have imagined. The weight of her brother's words settled in her heart, and she felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm finally home," she whispered.